Thank you for being here today. What if I told you that one of the world's most stable alliances was on the brink of collapse, not because of a foreign adversary, but because of a president's desire to simply absorb his closest neighbor? And what if the leader of that neighboring country, a political rookie, found a way to turn that existential threat into his greatest source of power? The world of international diplomacy is often a theater of carefully choreographed gestures and coded language. But the looming confrontation between United States President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney promises something far more raw. As Carney prepares to travel to the White House for a critical meeting, the stakes could not be higher, not just for the future of North American trade, but for the very sovereignty of Canada itself. At the heart of this high stakes showdown is the clash between two fundamentally opposing worldviews. On one side stands President Trump, a leader who views international relations as a zero sum game of dominance and submission, a transactional world where economic might gives him the right to dictate terms. His obsession with annexing Canada, which he has repeatedly and publicly referred to as America's potential 51st state, is the ultimate expression of this philosophy. On the other side is Prime Minister Carney, a political newcomer forged in the crucible of Trump's own making. He is a leader who owes his entire political career to resisting American pressure, a man who successfully transformed Trump's aggression into his greatest political weapon. This upcoming meeting is more than just a negotiation over trade policy. It is a direct test of Trump's strongman approach against the resilient power of democratic nationalism. The central thesis of this unfolding drama is a profound political irony. President Trump, in his relentless effort to bend Canada to his will, has spectacularly backfired. He has not only failed to intimidate his northern neighbor, but has inadvertently awakened a dormant sense of national identity, unified a fractured political landscape, and created his own worst nightmare, a Canadian leader with an undeniable democratic mandate to say no. To understand the depth of the current crisis, one must rewind to the beginning of Donald Trump's second term. Upon taking office in January, he wasted no time in launching what can only be described as a full scale economic assault on America's closest and most integrated ally. The opening salvo was a brutal 25% tariff on Canadian cars and parts, a move that struck at the heart of the deeply intertwined manufacturing sectors of both nations. This was quickly followed by a barrage of punishing levies on Canadian steel, aluminum, and energy. The message, delivered without subtlety, was clear: submit to American demands or watch your economy crumble. For Trump, this was a simple exercise in power politics. He believed that Canada, a nation of roughly 40 million people, was so economically dependent on the United States that it would have no choice but to capitulate. His strategy, however, did not stop at economic coercion. He began to openly and frequently float the idea of annexing Canada altogether. In interviews, at rallies, and in private meetings, he repeatedly called Canada America's 51st state, framing the notion not as a hypothetical, but as a logical endpoint of his pressure campaign. These were not casual, off the cuff remarks. They were calculated threats designed to psychologically intimidate a nation that sends more than 75% of its exports south of the border. Trump seemed to believe he could bully a sovereign country into existence. The initial impact was immediate and devastating, seemingly validating Trump's strategy. Canada's unemployment rate surged to 7.1% in August, reaching its highest level since May of 2016, excluding the anomalous period of the global pandemic. With nearly 3.6 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services crossing the border each day, Trump's tariffs were strangling a vital economic lifeline. Across the country, Canadian businesses began hemorrhaging money. Factory workers were handed layoff notices, supply chains were thrown into chaos, and the entire Canadian economy was sent reeling. From Trump's perspective in the Oval Office, his plan was working to perfection. He had Canada exactly where he wanted it, economically vulnerable, politically dependent, and he assumed on the verge of begging for mercy. The end game seemed simple: squeeze Canada until it broke, then dictate the terms of its surrender from a position of absolute and unassailable strength. But what Donald Trump failed to anticipate was that his relentless aggression would create the very resistance he was trying to crush. Into this political firestorm stepped Mark Carney, an unlikely national figure, a former central banker who had led the banks of Canada and England. Carney had never held elected office. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned in January amidst flagging approval ratings, Carney answered the call to lead the center left Liberal Party. At the time, the situation looked hopeless. The Liberals were trailing badly in the polls, facing what most pundits believed was a certain and humiliating electoral defeat. The Conservative Party was the clear front-runner, poised to cruise to an easy victory on a platform of restoring stability. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of cowering under Trump's immense pressure, Carney did the exact opposite. He leaned into the conflict and masterfully turned Trump himself into the central issue of the campaign. He ran an explicitly and unapologetically anti-Trump campaign, traveling the country to warn Canadians that their southern neighbor was not just being a tough negotiator, but was actively trying to steal their country. On election night, the atmosphere was electric as crowds chanted, "Never," in defiant response to Trump's annexation threats. Carney delivered a thunderous victory speech. America wants our land, our resources, our water, our country, he declared to a roaring crowd. President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen. The results were nothing short of stunning. The Liberal Party, which had been written off as a political casualty just months earlier, won 169 seats out of a total of 343. It was enough to form a minority government and keep Mark Carney as prime minister. It was a complete and dramatic reversal of political fortune, a comeback that left political analysts on both sides of the border scrambling for explanations. The consensus was overwhelming. As one Cornell University professor noted, President Trump single-handedly helped the Liberal Party recover from a very large popular opinion deficit in Canada to win the election. The supreme irony was that Trump, in his bid for total dominance, had inadvertently created his own most formidable opponent. He had handed a political novice a powerful and unifying cause, and in doing so, had engineered the rise of a Canadian leader armed with a fresh democratic mandate to resist American pressure at all costs. Following his improbable victory, Prime Minister Carney immediately began to implement what he termed an elbows up strategy, a quintessentially Canadian hockey term for aggressive defensive play. The message was unmistakable. Canada would no longer be a passive recipient of American policy. Carney made it clear in his first major foreign policy address that the old, comfortable relationship with the United States, which had been based on decades of deepening economic integration and tight security cooperation, is over. He went further, declaring that it was now clear the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner, and announced that his government would begin actively and urgently seeking alternatives to its deep seated American dependence. This was not mere rhetoric, it was backed by immediate and decisive action. In a sharp break with decades of tradition, where a new prime minister's first foreign trip is almost invariably to Washington, Carney made his first official visits to London and Paris. The symbolism was potent and intentional, signaling a strategic pivot back toward Canada's historic European allies. The policy shifts followed quickly. His government began collaborating with Australia on the development of new, sophisticated radar systems for the Arctic, an area of critical strategic importance where Canada had historically relied on American partnership. Soon after, reports emerged that major South Korean defense companies were in Ottawa, actively pitching military equipment sales to the Canadian government. This development was particularly significant as Canada had historically sourced the vast majority of its defense products from the United States. Meanwhile, Trump's economic warfare was having the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than forcing Canada to capitulate on trade, it was accelerating its push to diversify away from American markets and suppliers. While Canada did begin to drop some of its retaliatory tariffs, it was not an act of surrender. Instead, it was a strategic repositioning designed to align with USMCA trade agreement exemptions and ease the burden on Canadian consumers while the government pursued longer term solutions. Carney's elbows up strategy was a clear and comprehensive response to a new reality. He was signaling to the world and to Washington that if the United States was going to treat Canada as an adversary, then Canada would start acting like a nation with its own independent interests, forging new alliances and securing its own future without relying on its unpredictable southern neighbor. This strategic pivot was not just a matter of foreign policy. It sent profound ripples through the domestic landscapes of both nations, creating complex internal pressures that neither leader could ignore. Within Canada, Carney's defiant posture managed to consolidate a remarkable degree of national unity. While the initial economic shock was undeniably painful, a powerful narrative took hold. This was a necessary sacrifice for sovereignty. A grassroots Buy Canadian movement gained momentum, with citizens consciously choosing local products as a form of patriotic resistance. The business community, initially panicked by the tariffs began a grudging but steady shift in perspective. Industry leaders, faced with the stark unreliability of their largest market, started to see the long term wisdom in Carney's diversification push. Trade missions to the European Union and emerging markets in Asia were no longer seen as political theater, but as essential economic survival tactics. Even the conservative opposition, while sharply critical of the economic pain inflicted on workers, found itself in a difficult political position. Attacking Carney for standing up to Trump was untenable, as it risked being perceived as siding with an American president who was openly hostile to Canadian interests. This broad domestic consensus gave Carney a surprisingly strong hand, allowing him to absorb the economic blows while maintaining the public support for his resistance. Simultaneously, the economic pain was no longer a one-way street. Within the United States, the consequences of Trump's trade war began to bite, creating a subtle but growing chorus of dissent that reached the highest levels of government. The aluminum tariffs, in particular, proved to be a significant self inflicted wound. With nearly 75% of the aluminum used in American manufacturing coming from Canada, the cost of everything from beer cans to Ford F 150s began to rise, squeezing American manufacturers and consumers alike. The integrated North American auto industry, which relied on just in time delivery of parts across the border, was thrown into chaos, leading to production slowdowns and increased costs for Detroit's Big Three. Governors and members of Congress from northern border states like Michigan, Ohio, and New York, including some prominent Republicans, began to quietly voice their concerns to the White House. They were witnessing firsthand how the disruption was costing American jobs and investment in their districts. The agricultural sector also felt the sting, as Canada's carefully targeted retaliatory tariffs on American farm products from Kentucky bourbon to Wisconsin cheese hit Trump's political heartland. Furthermore, tourism in border towns on both sides of the 49th parallel suffered as political tensions discouraged casual travel. This growing internal economic friction fundamentally undermined the central premise of Trump's strategy, that he could inflict pain without feeling any himself. It exposed the reality that the economic destinies of the two nations were far more intertwined than he had appreciated, and that a war on Canada's economy would inevitably have casualties at home. This shifting reality on the ground set the stage for the leaders' first direct encounter, with Trump facing not only a defiant Canadian prime minister, but also a growing list of domestic stakeholders who were questioning the wisdom of his economic assault. The first face to face meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney, which took place in May, revealed just how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. Trump, perhaps dimly recognizing that his strategy had backfired, attempted to take credit for Carney's electoral success. "I think I was probably the greatest thing that happened to him," Trump said, with his characteristic lack of self awareness, completely missing the point that Carney's victory was a direct repudiation of his own policies. But when the conversation in the Oval Office turned serious, Trump immediately brought up annexation. Carney's response was devastating in its elegant simplicity. As you know from real estate, the former banker told the property mogul, "There are some places that are never for sale. Trump's reply: never say, never only served, to reinforce how profoundly out of touch he was with the new political reality his own actions had created. Carney later revealed he had privately asked Trump to stop calling Canada the 51st state, a request that was clearly ignored. Now, as Carney prepares for his return to the White House next week, the context has become even more charged. The timing is particularly significant as it coincides with Trump's renewed push for his Golden Dome missile defense program. Trump recently claimed, without providing evidence, that Canada had called Washington asking to be covered by the proposed missile shield. His alleged response was a crude reiteration of his annexation theme. Well, why don't you just join our country, become the 51st state, and you get it for free? This latest episode shows that Trump remains either unable or unwilling to understand how counterproductive his rhetoric has become. Looming over the entire meeting is the crucial review of the USMCA trade agreement scheduled for the year 2026. Both sides know that the outcome of this review could reshape the North American economy for decades to come. The structure of the agreement requires the three member countries to continuously negotiate an extension, creating a state of perpetual uncertainty that makes it incredibly difficult for businesses, especially large manufacturers like automakers, to make long term investment decisions. This constant state of negotiation, with the threat of dissolution hanging over the pact, gives Trump significant leverage. But the political context has fundamentally changed since their last encounter. Carney is no longer the untested newcomer trying to find his footing on the world stage. He arrives in Washington as a leader who has proven that Trump's intimidation tactics can be turned into political gold. He carries with him a clear and unambiguous mandate from Canadian voters to resist American pressure, and he has already shown he is more than willing to use it. As the meeting approaches, the risks for both leaders are enormous, though they are not symmetrical. For Prime Minister Carney, there is the immediate danger that President Trump will try to publicly embarrass him by raising the 51st state issue again, seeking to portray him as a weak leader of a supplicant nation. There is also a domestic political risk. If no apparent progress on the trade front is made, his conservative opponents will undoubtedly accuse him of failing to protect Canadian jobs and address the ongoing trade war. But the risks for President Trump may be even greater. His entire approach to Canada has been built on the flawed assumption that overwhelming economic pressure would inevitably force capitulation. That strategy has not only failed, but it has actively strengthened his opposition. If this high profile meeting produces no breakthroughs for the US, or worse, if it devolves into another public relations disaster, it will further expose the severe limitations of Trump's transactional bullying approach to international relations. By framing the relationship purely in terms of dominance and submission rather than mutual benefit, he has created political constraints for both sides that did not exist before. Trump's failure in Canada is rooted in a complete and profound misreading of the Canadian political landscape. His core assumption that economic pressure would create overwhelming political pressure for accommodation ignored the deep, often underestimated wells of Canadian nationalism that his threats would inevitably tap. Canadians may be pragmatic and closely tied to the United States economically, but they are also fiercely protective of their sovereignty, their distinct identity, and their political independence. This is a fundamental truth that Trump either did not understand or, more likely, chose to ignore. The broader implications of this diplomatic saga extend far beyond North American trade relations. Trump's failure in Canada serves as a powerful case study on the limitations of his preferred negotiating style when dealing with Democratic allies. Unlike authoritarian leaders who can dismiss or suppress public opinion, Democratic leaders like Mark Carney are directly accountable to voters. And as the Canadian election demonstrated, those voters may actually be energized by foreign pressure rather than intimidated by it. This dynamic has already pushed Canadian policy in directions that run counter to long term American interests. Canada's strategic pivot toward other allies, its exploration of alternative defense suppliers, and its growing skepticism about American reliability are all direct consequences of Trump's aggressive approach. Instead of creating a more compliant and pliable neighbor, Trump has created a more independent and wary one. As the diplomatic motorcades prepare to converge on Washington, both sides are carefully managing expectations. Prime Minister Carney has already told reporters not to expect white smoke, a Vatican reference, signaling the selection of a new pope, suggesting that major breakthroughs are highly unlikely. This measured approach reflects Carney's astute understanding that his political strength is derived from being seen as a leader who can stand up to Trump, not as one who caves to American pressure. Trump, meanwhile, continues to project an aura of unwavering confidence despite the obvious failure of his strategy. His recent comments that they all want to make a deal because we have something that they all want reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of the changed dynamics. Mark Carney does not need a deal with Trump. His political success came from successfully resisting Trump. The economic fundamentals that tie the two nations together remain unchanged. Canada is still the top export destination for 36 U.S. states, approximately 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. Furthermore, Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the U.S. and possesses 34 of the critical minerals and metals that the Pentagon considers essential for national security. These realities create powerful incentives for both countries to find workable solutions. But Trump's approach has made those solutions infinitely harder to achieve.